Hi, this is our Christian Concept Sunday School lesson. I'm Dr. Christie, and this week's focus is found in the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verses 1 through 14, and it is entitled, The Word Becomes Flesh. Our study this week answers the question, who is Jesus? This week's lesson covers 5 points. There are 2 goals of our focus. The outline of our passage is divided into 4 sections. The key verse is John 1, verse 3. We will share some interesting facts about John. We will read the scriptures, chapter 1, verses 1 through 14, and offer a short summary. There are 2 goals we hope that you will attain as you go through your study and focus on the identity, answering the question, who is Jesus? First, you should be able to identify what the word means, what is shared by the evangelist John as he introduced it to us. And then 2, you should be able to identify one way he or she can continue the mission of John the Baptist and make a plan to commit to it. Again, there are 4 sections of the outline. Part 1 is covering verses 1 through 5, and you might want to focus on it being centered on the eternal Word. Verses 1 through 3 is introducing to us being with God. That's part A of section 1. Part B covers verses 4 and 5, and we read about the light in darkness. Section 2 is entitled The Human Witness, and it covers verses 6, 7, and 8. Part A of section 2, we read about how Jesus was sent by God, and that's covered in verses 6 and 7. And then in verse 8, part B of this section, we read how this is testifying to Jesus being the light. Section 3, we entitle it as the true light, and that's covering verses 9 through 13. Part A of this 3rd section, we read how he was rejected by some, and that's introduced to us in verses 9, 10, and 11. And then part B of this section, this 3rd section, we read how Jesus was accepted by some children of God, those who are believers, and that's in verses 12 and 13. Section 4 is entitled The Only Son, and that is introduced to us in verse 14. Part A, which covers verse 14A section and B section, we read how Jesus actually lived and dwelt among all of humanity. And then 14C, we read how Jesus was, in fact, glorified. The key verse of this lesson is found in verse 3. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And so that you can reflect on other names of Jesus, I've included a chart that might call to your remembrance or introduce to you some new names that have been utilized through the Bible and through history for Jesus Christ. Yes, he is called Jesus. He is also called Emmanuel, Yahweh, the Good Shepherd. Our lesson calls him the Word. He is the living God, the Prince of Peace. He is truth, the Lord of hosts, the Holy One, the second Adam. He is also called our friend, the wonderful counselor. He has been a mediator for some of you. He has been an advocate for others. He is King of Kings, Christ, the Lion of Judah. He has been the deliverer. He is our Redeemer, the bread of life. Jesus says further in this book 7 times, I am. He is the way. He is the light of the world. Here are some interesting facts about John and the book of John, the Gospel of John. John means Yahweh has been gracious. The author, of course, is John. Between 60 and 90 AD, this book has been written, and it is the 43rd book in the Bible, the 4th book in the New Testament. There are 21 chapters in the Gospel of John and 879 verses with over 19,000 words, depending on the version you read. And some observations about John that you may have noticed. In Mark chapter 3, verse 17, Jesus nicknames John and his brother James the sons of thunder. John was also the son of Zebedee and Salome, who Salome sometimes traveled with Jesus and the disciples. It appears that John was a disciple of John the Baptist first until he was called to follow Jesus at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. That's shared in chapter 1 of our lesson, verses 19 as well. John is mentioned 3 times in the book of Acts, and each time it is associated with the disciple Peter. And that's found in the book of Acts, chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 8. According to Revelation, chapter 1, verse 9, John was exiled to the Isle of Patmos by the Romans. This same John, who was the evangelist and the disciple, he's mostly identified as a disciple who Jesus loved. And biblical tradition says that John later lived in Ephesus. Ephesus was one of the places that Apostle Paul started the Christian church. John also was second only to Apostle Paul in the number of New Testament books that he wrote. So, John wrote and is credited to be the author of this book, John, and then 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, as well as the concluding book in our Bible and the New Testament, the book of Revelation. Another interesting fact is that John was probably the last surviving apostle. And it is written in John chapter 20, verse 31, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that in believing you may have life in his name. So that we can understand the reason for John's writing of this gospel this way, we do know that the Gospel of Matthew was written for a Jewish audience, so that they would know he was part of their culture. The book of Mark was written for the audience of the Roman people and the surrounding residents who lived there. The book of Luke was written for a Greek audience. And this book, John, was written for everyone to know that Jesus was eternally with God in the beginning. So we find that John focuses on the meanings of the Lord's actions, why he did something, rather than the actual listing of the events itself. This book, John, is topical rather than being so much chronological. And here, again, we find those 7 I am statements that Jesus shared. 1 John chapter 6, verse 35, and mentioned again, verse 48, I am the bread of life. John chapter 8, verse 12, and again, chapter 9, verse 5. It is written, I am the light of the world. In the 10th chapter of this book, verses 7 and 9, Jesus says, I am the door. In John chapter 10, verse 11, and then again 14, he shares, I am the good shepherd. In John chapter 11, verse 25, it is written that Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. In John chapter 14, verse 6, it is written, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And the 7th I am statement that Jesus is credited to saying, found in chapter 15, verse 1, Jesus says, I am the vine. So, we read of who Jesus is according to how the evangelist wrote about Jesus. And another interesting fact is that in this book of John, Jesus Christ refers to the Father, his Father, our Father, more than 100 times. Our lesson includes 14 verses of chapter 1. Verse 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Verse 2, he was with God in the beginning. Verse 3, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. Verse 4, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. Verse 5, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Verse 6, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. Verse 8, he himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. Verse 9, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. Verse 10, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Verse 11, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Verse 12, yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Verse 13, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. And then verse 14, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and In summary, John discloses Christ's identity with his very first words, which are, again in verse 1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." He was with God in the beginning, and the rest of the book continues the same emphasis in this theme. John, the eyewitness to Jesus who walked with him as his disciple, chose 8 of Christ's miracles, or signs as some of them called them, and he called it himself, to reveal Christ's divine and human nature and his life-giving mission. And these signs that he included in this gospel are: 1, turning water to wine; 2, healing the official son; 3, healing the sick man at Bethsaida; 4, feeding the 5,000 with just a few loaves of bread; 5, walking on the water; 6, restoring sight to the blind man; and then 7, raising Lazarus from the dead. And then finally, John writes about Jesus' resurrection truth. In summary, we realize that God spoke and galaxies whirled into place, stars burned the heavens, and planets began orbiting their suns. Words of awesome, unlimited, unleashed power. And in this last chart of names for Jesus Christ, I've included for you, again, for you to reflect and for sure to call on him for just those aspects that these names embody. Jesus Christ, again, came as fully God and fully man. He is omniscient as well as omnipotent and omnipresent. He is the Son of Man as well as God made flesh. He's the Word. He's the way. He's King of Kings, righteous and immutable. He's our faithful friend and eternal. So we've learned in our lesson for this week that in the first 5 verses of chapter 1, the Logos, the Word, Jesus, is described, and his description includes his pre-existence for being in the beginning with God. We learn of Jesus' nature and the creative power of the Logos. And in John chapter 1, verses 6 through 14, the last verses of this study today, it speaks of Jesus as entering into the world, becoming a man, and then teaching and demonstrating and revealing the Father, which also has given him his purpose, who he is as the person, and his power. This is Dr. Christie, and we trust that you have been introduced to some thoughts here that will help you in your study of who Jesus is and settle those questions in your own walk of faith. We hope that if you enjoyed our study, that you will give us a thumbs up, share this video, or leave a comment, and consider subscribing. Until we study with you again, may God's peace be with you, and stay safe.